Okay, how long do you think you'll be all together? Okay, okay. What basement are you in? The Opera House? I'm the one that's on the street, but only for 2 hours because that's as long as I can stand.
It's not comfortable.
Nah, it's not good. It's not good.
And look at this.
I'm in my socks.
Stocking feet.
It's worse than that. I have a hole in my sock. I don't know which one. Very rarely, very rarely.
But it does happen.
People will think that my relationship to the keys is a fetish, you know. I'm sort of have to know where they are all the time.
Right.
And if I don't, it's not panic, it's just...
I put a thing like that. Yeah, this is it's got a thing I can clip it to my belt or, you know, hold it like this. It's harder to lose.
Yeah, well,
because when you drop it, it makes a big sound.
I got a clump of keys on mine, a clump. Because I have keys to all these different spaces, you know. I've got my studio, I've got the drawing, got this place here, you know, just all over the place.
This could be the whole show right here.
What whole show?
The whole show we're doing. The whole show we're doing this morning could be right here on the doorstep.
You know, by the time we get in there, the whole show will melt and it won't be there.
It'll have folded.
It'll be drawn and it will be laying on the floor.
Poor Jackson Pollock.
Oh, good old Jackson. You're going to get a kick out of this, you know. This thing is actually more historical than it is, well, is it 50-50? No, 60-40. 60 historical, 40 something else. What the something else is, though, I don't know.
I was almost positive the last time I tried this, I didn't have it, I couldn't find a key to it. Oh, there we go.
It goes the other way. You are a man, a gentleman, a scholar, a whiz, if ever there was a whiz.
That's it. I got lucky. I do have one.
Thanks, Rob.
All right.
So, Bill, I'm going to get you to tell me about Jackson Pollock, a little bit of background, because there may be one or two people out there who've never heard of the guy. In the art world, he's a legend.
He's sometimes considered the cowboy artist. He's also referred to occasionally as Jack the Dripper, because essentially he painted paintings by dripping paint. I mean, almost everybody knows about the paint that sort of dripped on the canvas. The one thing that Jackson sort of wanted to accomplish right from the beginning is to diffuse the influence of Cubism on modern art. And he ended up doing something that I think is as abstract as it can possibly be. He would be totally lost in the motion, as you know, in the physical part of his. It's almost like a dance, a ritualistic dance that he does while he paints these things, and basically it's sort of like that energy, that flow. He basically said, you know, I am part of it all, like everything else. I mean, it's that kind of I don't know, spiritual mysticism that sort of drove him. Once somebody says, well, he doesn't draw from nature, he says, I don't draw from nature. I am nature. So it's you can see in those kind of quotes, there's a core here that's more than just you know, making images. When he was painting, he would get totally lost in the activity, and what he would do is he would stop, and he called it his get acquainted moment, where he would sit back and sort of visualize and realize what he had done for the last half hour, I don't know for however long. But that was Jackson Pollock. He was controversial when he was alive, and he's been controversial ever since. One of the things I've always attributed to Jackson Pollock is that most of the early 20th century art was about well, it was about being alive. It was about existence, you know, and it was basically an argument that was started with Giotto back in the 14th century. This was a product of the Cold War, and the CIA realized, you have to understand that this organization within the CIA is called Hidden Hands. Actually, it has another name, but the there's a video called Hidden Hands that explains the whole thing. But they saw abstract expressionism as the most profound example of Americans having free expression or being capable of free expression, which they felt was the antithesis to what was going on in Soviet Russia. And so they weaponized abstract expressionism to show to the Russian people that, in fact, what they have culturally is a sort of a repressed culture. And here in the United States, we have a totally open culture, capable of absolute free expression, of which Jackson Pollock was the prime example. And so what they did is they weaponized abstract expressionism as part of their Cold War strategy. And they organized exhibitions that traveled all over the country. They had not control, but influence over many magazines and publications. And for instance, there was this article. This whole show is based on this article that appeared in August of 1949 in Life magazine. They said, "Is Jackson Pollock the greatest living painter in America?" There's no doubt in my mind, because this is what they did. This was part of their strategy. What's interesting about that is, before the article, all the abstract expressionists, that whole group that I mentioned, Rothko, de Kooning, Gorky, and so on, would hang out at this bar in New York called the Cedar Bar, and they would talk about art. They would talk about the importance of abstract art. They would talk about color. They would talk about visual dynamics. They would talk about compositional forces, and they would go on and on. Artists do like to talk about that sort of thing. But I would say that the transitional guy in that is Frank Stella. I mean, he was painting abstract paintings, but they transitioned into something else. And, in 1957, Jasper Johns painted the Three Flags. This is the year after Jackson Pollock died. This is exactly, 7 years after, 8 years after the article in Life magazine, and only 7 years before Andy Warhol made his Brillo boxes. So, that whole transition was, and that was a seismic transition that happened between 1949 and 1964. I mean, if you think about, did you know that there was a Whitney Museum once did a show called Art in the first half of the 20th century of American art, and then the second half of the year was the second half. And the two exhibitions were like from different universes. I mean, they were just not the same thing. And that's kind of what happened, when they wrote this article. They sort of decapitated what modernism had been. And so it's then it became what we refer to as postmodernism. It's so interesting. You look at that period of time. It was an incredibly energetic and wild, just wonderful. But you had, pop art, you had conceptual art, you had photorealism, you had pop art, you had conceptual art. You had all of these different things sort of going on at the same time, and they all seem like they're disparate and they're far away from each other. But the one thing they all had in common is they were not Jackson Pollock, they were not Mark Rothko, they were not any of it. It was, again, from a different universe, and that transition has been. Actually, it's almost more profound than what happened between the 14th, 13th century and the 16th century. That Quattrocento, the linear perspective, Renaissance. Think about it. Here you are in 1950, and life was what it was, but all of a sudden you have Bill Barrows writing Naked Lunch, you have Jack Kerouac on the road, you have Rauschenberg painting a painting that's all white, Jasper Johns with his flags. You have, you know, it's the rock star. Oh, anyway, it just everything changed. Music changed, art changed, everything changed just during that period between the article about Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. It was just like, it's just every time it's so incredible to me. I got to live through that. I was in high school. I went into high school the year Jackson Pollock died, and I went to college in 1960, and my whole informative years were right in the middle of that thing. I was in college. I went to art school, and all the heroes were those abstract guys. And going back historically to Rubens and Rembrandt. I mean, and then all of a sudden, I'm a junior in college, and there's Andy Warhol with his Coke bottles and soup cans and Brillo boxes. And it was the absolute antithesis of everything I had been taught. Basically, it just sort of took out my whole formal education and threw it out the window, and I was angry. I mean, I was revolted against this, and it was when I was a graduate student, I wrote a paper where I was going to basically explain why, just like Clement Greenberg tried to explain why pop art was bullshit, and I looked at a lot of it, I read a lot of stuff, and it's like something clicked in my brain, and all of a sudden, oh yes, I see what that's about. Yes, and once your brain does that, you can't look at, Matisse and Andy Warhol with the same brain. It takes a different brain to sort of make them equate in any way in terms of being culturally significant. I mean, it's a different brain that happened between 1949, when that magazine came out, and 1964. And this is kind of what that's all. This is sort of what that's all about. This show. I mean, it's not about Jackson Pollock. It's about this thing that happened between those, and a lot of it, I think was triggered by that article. Sometimes I think these things are sort of woven together, not so much by chance, but by design. I mean, there's the CIA. Look at abstract expressionism. This is free expressionism. We can really go with this. And then all of a sudden, abstract expressionism is this powerful cultural icon in the American psyche, whether they liked it or not. When the article came out 2 weeks later, one of the things that sort of I like doing these paintings is there were letters to the editor, two that I remember. One was a guy from California who said, I've been cleaning my paintbrushes on my garage wall for the last 20 years. It looks an awful lot like number 17. The first $1,500 can take it. And then there was another one from a gallery up in Provincetown that had a show, and they had number 17, Jackson Pollock's number 17. And underneath it, they had this sign that said, do you think Jackson Pollock is the greatest living painter in America? And you could vote. And you said no or yes, and you can put your little ballots in these boxes. Well, the vote ended up something like 163 no's to 12 yeses. So, and Congress, when, the United States Congress and Harry Truman, when they realized that, they only thought this modern art was a communist plot. And when they found out the CIA was spending money putting together exhibitions to travel, they had a fit and conniption. All the conservative people in the United States in the 50s was still pretty conservative. But they had, and then they tried to shut them down, the CIA. They had bought all of this art, and they forced them to auction it off, and they were selling like for $30-35 a pop. Things that are now worth millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, if you will. I wish I was there. I would have bought a couple. I was too young. I didn't know anything about art then. But anyway, and so then they started setting up phony institutions that they could funnel money through to keep their Hidden Hands project going. It's such an incredible story, this thing about the CIA and how this whole thing played out. Yeah, the confluence of art and politics and CIA and geopolitical forces, the communism, capitalism. It's just everything just sort of came together during that period between that magazine article and 1964. It's just all meshed together, That's just every time I think about that period and that I got to live through it and virtually had absolutely no idea what was going on. But, when I can reflect on it, I say, oh, yeah, I can remember that happening. I can remember this. I mean, I can remember, being so on and so forth. It's just, so anyway, this whole thing is kind of about, at least that side. This is something else over here, but it's also connected.